Welcome to iRanza Insights, real talk about childhood emotional abuse. I am Jasmine Hollis, founder and president of iRanza Corporation, where we raise awareness of childhood emotional abuse and provide tools for healing. I am here today with Mrs. Rivera, the owner and lead therapist of La Luz Counseling, a mental health service in San Antonio, Texas. Her practice focuses on healing from traumatic experiences and tough transitions for children and adults. Thank you so much for agreeing to meet with me today.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
So for my first question, what do you do specifically? What is your practice?
Sure. So I have a practice called La Luz Counseling, and I'm the owner and group private practice provider there. And so what we do is we do mental health counseling for kids, adults, and anybody else in between, sometimes couples, sometimes families. And so I run a little office where there's about 3 of us.
What might trauma look like for someone?
The hard part about trauma is that it's kind of disguised and it looks a whole lot like something else that it's not. We've seen trauma and it comes disguised as people looking like they're really angry. We've had a lot of people say, like, I have anger issues, or people have told me that I don't know how to control my feelings. We've also seen this coming in the face of depression. And so some people have even come to us and they say, I've been diagnosed with depression, major depressive disorder. So they look kind of down or sad, discouraged, hopeless about the future. We've also seen some others who have been diagnosed with something like anxiety, where they have a hard time just kind of calming down and be able to get through day-to-day things. And so the crazy part about that is people don't have the awareness sometimes to talk about some of the other stuff that happened before these symptoms started. So one of the things that we do a little bit differently is we kind of work from what's going on now and we go backwards a little bit. So we say, okay, this is some of what it looks like today and right now, but let's go ahead and travel backwards to see when it all started. And a lot of times there's some unique situation, event, something really challenging where a person was placed in a position where they felt unsafe, where they actually were unsafe, or maybe they went through something personally or saw something bad happen to someone else. All of those would constitute as trauma. And so sometimes it takes a little while for those symptoms to come out. So you'll hear people say, well, that was 10 years ago. That was 30 years ago. That was 5 years ago. But the truth is, with trauma, there's no timeline or deadline as to when people start experiencing this kind of stuff sometimes.
What kinds of events in a person's life may contribute to those sorts of feelings later on?
That's the hard part, right? Is really it's up to the perception of that person. So one of the things that we've seen a whole lot, and the way I describe it, is something called secondary trauma, or trauma that's witnessed with someone else. So have you ever heard about the really bad effects of smoking, like cigarettes?
Kind of like lung
How
disease?
cigarettes, well, let's just say cigarettes are bad, right? Don't use them.
Yeah.
Well, what we know now is that cigarette smoke is not just bad for the person using it, but the person who's next to them who's not using it. So even somebody around that person can still have really bad effects of the cigarette smoke. That's called secondhand smoke. Well, it's kind of the same thing with trauma. So even if you're not the person who's going through that actual trauma and feeling it personally yourself, but you see it or are around it, that all qualifies. So unfortunately, we've seen people who have been exposed to different challenging things like domestic violence. So they see someone else in a really violent or aggressive situation. There's lots of people who are fleeing really dangerous situations or places. They're called immigrants or refugees. There's also people who have gone through really, really challenging things, like a loved one's sickness or the diagnosis of something really hard with somebody that they love. So there's so many different situations that can qualify or constitute as traumatic.
How might difficult transitions in a child's life, such as these, inadvertently contribute to childhood emotional abuse?
So can you ask that question again?
Yes, how might difficult transitions in a child's life inadvertently contribute to childhood emotional abuse?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things that people expect for kids to just be okay with without really realizing how hard some of this stuff could be. And so I think there's not a lot of preparation or kind of there's not a lot of support there for kids to know what to expect or how to feel when certain things happen. So for example, when a kid's parents divorce, they might talk a little bit about the divorce while it's happening, but the truth is that your perspective on your parents' divorce changes a whole lot from the time you're 5 to when you're 10 to when you're 15 or about to start dating. Like that all shifts your perspective on something. So a lot of times there's not that follow through of support over a series of time. So they think just because that situation is come and gone, that that person might not need help anymore. Another thing that we've seen is that as a person develops, their level of understanding changes. So I always say that the mind of a child thinks as a child, the mind of a teenager thinks as a teenager, and the mind of an adult thinks as an adult. So the way that you would look at something when you're 7 years old is very different than how you look at that same thing when you're 15, and how that's going to look very different again when you're 25. So that's really important that there's an ongoing supportive person who can kind of say, hey, I know that looks a little bit different for you now. Like I've had some people who have said, well, it wasn't that big of a deal. My parents would just drink and party all the time, but it didn't really faze me. And I'm like, oh, okay. So when are you going to drink and party so your kids are around that all the time? And they're like, I would never do that. So it was okay if it happened to you, but it's not okay for you to do it to somebody else. Like, help me to understand. So I think a lot of times people don't really understand how their perspective can change. And then the emotions that come with that realization also change.
So, how can someone get to a place where they realize that maybe they do need help working through some things that have happened? Because a lot of the times they don't get counseling because they don't realize that there is an issue.
Yeah. So thankfully, like for me and you right now, we live in a pretty big city where there's lots of resources. So for example, what you're doing right now, it's spreading awareness for somebody who comes across this will say, hey, that sounds like me. There's lots of people like you who are willing to share the message and lots of people like me who are willing to say, here's what you can do about it. Now, one of the best ways, honestly, is by trusting the people around you. So a lot of times when we're in certain situations, it's hard for us to see clearly because we don't have the right perspective on it. But with the people around us, our best friends, our parents, or a loved one, they're able to look at things and say, hey, like every time this happens, you respond this way. And you're like, no, I don't. Well, chances are you do. So having some healthy, we call that accountability. So somebody who's willing to vouch for you to be able to call out your blind spots is really, really helpful. So relying on a supportive person. Another thing too is when in doubt, going, for example, if you attend school at almost, I mean, the majority of schools that I've seen, elementary, middle school, high school, and college, there's often some type of person there who can help. So that might be a school counselor, that might be communities and schools, that might be a case manager or social worker, someone along those lines. And for the record, those services for students are free. There's not a lot of free things in this world, and that it happens to be one of them. So when in doubt, if you say, I feel like something's wrong and I don't even know where to start, it's kind of like relying on yourself to speak a foreign language. Sometimes you need to get some extra help from a tutor, or in this case, a person in the field who can say, I know what's going on here and I can help you through that.
So, if you have a friend who you see is going through something difficult and it's affecting them negatively, how do you begin a conversation with them about it?
Yeah, so I really feel like that's going to depend on the person and their age. Because the truth is, if you're 13 and I'm 33, who's going to have more access to resources? Well, probably the one that's a little bit older. So talking with a trusted person or an adult is always a great place to start. So whether that is your aunt or your uncle or a parent to say, hey, I think this might be going on with this person and I don't know what to do. So in this case, let's pretend that you're asking me that. I would definitely let that person know that you're there for them and that you've noticed a few things and that you just want to be there to love them and support them through it. More than anything, that person needs to be seen and heard and validated. And from there, sometimes saying, I'll go with you to go talk to Mr. So and so, or I'll go with you to talk to Miss So and so is enough for them to build courage and then be able to go with you. So, friends go a really, really long way. So if you see that happening with your friend, first, I would encourage you to, again, talk to somebody that you trust about it first to tag team with it. And then talking with your friend and saying, I just am telling you this because I love you, but I do notice some of these things or some of these things going on. So it's really important to never assume. So you always want to clarify, make sure you're on the right track, because sometimes I'll say, oh my gosh, no, I just had a new baby brother and I can't sleep at all. And that's why I feel so crazy. So there might be another reason. So it's always best to assume, but always letting them know that you're there is a great place to start. But just remember that once they do share something with you, that you don't have to be sworn to secrecy. You don't have to promise to keep some kind of secret. The best thing that you could do actually in that case is to not keep a secret. The best thing that you can do is to talk to someone and let that person know what's going on, even if that means that your friend is going to be really, really pissed off at you. But at least they're going to be safe and pissed off at you.
So, how can one tell the difference between childhood emotional abuse and the average experience of being a kid?
Yeah, so there's some really significant things. And one of those things I kind of mentioned earlier was when you're exposed to something traumatic, it really is kind of a combination of things. And one of those things is something that we call a physiological response. And a physiological response is something that happens inside of your body, and it kind of disallows you from having any kind of control. So, for example, a physiological response might be sweating, or your heart beating really fast, or your pupils dilating and constricting really fast. You don't have any control over that. It's not like, okay, heart, you ready to beat really fast? It's not like that. It's different. And so, what a physiological response is it's kicking off your stress response. We call that a sympathetic nervous response system. So the stress is kind of going off and it's signaling to the brain that something very wrong is happening right now. Something not good is happening right now. But it's really hard because you're not quite sure what to do about it. So you find yourself in a position where you're like, I think something is wrong and I'm not really quite sure what it is. And I also don't know what to do about it. Sometimes that could paralyze someone almost in a state of shock or fear, uncertainty, or they can respond in really outward aggressive ways, but pretty much it's an overwhelming sense of fear, lack of safety, something being very, very wrong, or the livelihood, somebody's life being at risk. So your life could be at risk, or somebody else's life could be at risk. Those all constitute as traumatic events.
And what are some specific things people can do on their own in terms of setting healthy boundaries, protecting their mental health and self esteem if they can't get access to counseling?
Yeah, so one of my favorite things to do is sometimes we have to train the mind. So the crazy thing about traumatic experiences is sometimes it can trick your mind into believing that it's happening all over again. Sometimes when people start recalling or getting triggered by a memory of this event, they can almost feel like, oh my gosh, it's happening again. That's why they become hypervigilant. Remember that heart beating really fast, those pupils dilating. Sometimes their blood will start to rush to different parts of their body and it'll tighten it, almost as though somebody is flexing and making a muscle. All of these are triggers of something called PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, or a reaction to a traumatic event. So what's happening is the mind is tricking the body. At that point, they're not friends. The mind and the body are not friends. Your mind and your body are actually best friends, but in this situation, they are not. So the mind, forgive my language, they're having an oh crap moment. So the mind is like, something's wrong, things are really bad. And then the body says, oh my God, something's wrong, you're right. So one of the things that we have to do is we have to tell the mind, you're not there anymore. That bad thing that happened, It's not happening right now. Remember, like you're sitting in class, or remember you're in a car, or no, you're at your grandma's house. So you have to tell your mind literally, like, you're not there. The mind, though, is a very strong thing. It'll say, yes, I am. Yes, I am. You don't know. So one of the things that I tell people is that your body, right, they're friends, your body has to say, okay, we need you to come back. We need you to come back to this moment. And the best way to do that is to kind of take a look around in your own space and tell your body where you're at. So we actually have 5 senses, 7, depending on how you want to look at it. But for the sake of this conversation, there's 5 senses that you have, right? Like what you see, what you smell, what you taste, blah, 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 all the stuff you know. My favorite thing to do is a 3, 2, 1 strategy. And what that is you tell your body to engage 3 of its senses. So for example, 3 things that you can see right now in this moment. So for example, I can see my blue couch right here, I can see my gray pen, and I can see you right in front of me. Those are 3 things that I can see with my eyes. Then I would ask myself, what are 2 things that I can feel, for example, and not emotions, but something that you can hard like feel. So for example, my cup, I can feel it. Then I would say, what is 1 thing that you could hear? So now we're using the sense of hearing, right? What can I hear? My air conditioner. So what that's telling the mind is based off of things that you can see and hear and feel right in front of you. Where are you? And the mind's like, oh my God, I totally got lost for a second. And so what you're doing is you're just bringing it back to the present moment. So things like stress and anxiety associated with trauma very rarely are existing in this moment. It's just a memory of something that has happened before that they feel like could be happening again. When in reality, most of the time it's not. Did that answer your question? I know that's kind of like a long response there.
Yes, it did. Thank you. And that's all I have for today. Thank you so much for agreeing to meet with me.
You're so welcome. I really enjoyed it. I hope it helped.